Hello everybody, this is Tip Top MTG here today with another Magic the Gathering video. In today's video, I am breaking down all of the spoilers that have come out today being March 30th for Strixhaven School of Mages. So essentially I'll be going in Wooburg order, talking about each card, talking about my opinions on it, whether it's how it'll be in constructed, whether in different formats for that matter, as well as limited, and just my thoughts on the card in general. Why don't we jump right into this? Starting off, we have Defend the Campus. It's a 4-cost white instant, and it says, choose one. Creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn, and destroy target creature with power 4 or greater. Now, I don't love to super analyze commons, because a lot of the time they're there for limited purposes, and this is definitely a pretty good card in limited, as modal cards generally work really well, where you can, use this for the removal if you need it, or use it for the boost if you need it. And honestly, this is probably going to be more often played for the not the boost, the removal spell. And so I think it's actually not that bad of a card. Of course, if we're talking about constructed, it won't see play because we have like Giant Killer, which is essentially just a better version of this card. And so it's not going to see play in constructed, but in limited, it seems like it could do a decent amount. Next, we have Combat Professor. It's a 4-cost white creature bird cleric, 2/3 with flying, and it says at the beginning of combat on your turn, target creature you control gets +1/+0 and gains vigilance until end of turn. Very garbage, in my opinion. We have a professor or a dean that does something very similar, but it does it with like all your creatures, and instead of just giving them +1/+0, you can instead make them get like +0/+0, or sorry, +0/+1. So we have one, and I believe it's either 3 or 4 mana value. So this is just purely worse than like another card in the set. So not my favorite. Next, we have Clever Lumamancer. It's a 1-cost white creature, human wizard, 0/1, and it has Magecraft. Whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, it gets +2/+2 until end of turn. So there was a 1-cost red dog from Zendikar Rising that I really underestimated. It got +2/+2 every time you played a land. And it was a 0/1. And I was like, this seems kind of fine, but I don't think it's going to do much. But it ended up being a pretty powerful card. I don't know necessarily how much play it saw, but when it got used against me, it came out very quickly in aggro decks. And so I think if you're running a more aggro-y, maybe Boros, spell-slinging kind of deck, this could maybe do a lot of work. And if you do run maybe mono white, maybe you introduce more combat boost elements to it, and then make this like something interesting like that. I also think in a deck that likes Heroic was a mechanic from Theros where whenever you targeted a creature with a spell, I don't remember if they got the same effect or something happened, but basically you target a creature with a spell and an effect happens. This, you don't even have to target Clever Lumamancer, but you can. For instance, a spell that gives this thing +1/+1 in Double Strike actually gives it +3/+3 in Double Strike, and now you have a pretty big creature. For instance, I have a historic deck, and you might have seen it in background things of my videos, that's all about this one card that gets +3/+0 whenever you cast an instant or sorcery. And this does something very, very, very similar. And so I think if you're running like a heroic type deck where it's all about combat boost, this works really well in that too. Next, we have Stonebinders Familiar. It's a 1-cost creature spirit dog, 1/1. Whenever one or more cards are put into exile during your turn, put a +1/+1 counter on Stonebinders Familiar. This ability triggers only once each turn. So this reminds me a lot of the Fox from Ikoria. It's a 1-drop, 1/1, that again gets bigger whenever you do something. The Fox got bigger every time you cycled. This dog gets bigger only once per turn, but it's whenever one or more cards are put into exile. Now, it doesn't say from your graveyard like a lot of the cards do, but there are a decent amount of effects that are going to take things from your graveyard and exile them. It also works well with, exiling your opponent's stuff. So pretty interesting in my opinion. It works really well actually with like Foretell. So I think if you're running a Foretell deck, this could definitely be an inclusion because you can kind of just take your hand, Foretell one card, boom, get this to trigger. So yeah, in both standard and historic and like older formats, this would go in a Foretell deck. Next, we have Resculpt. Now, this one's really interesting. It is a common, but I do want to talk about it. It's a 2-cost blue instant. Exile target artifact or creature. Its controller creates a 4/4 blue and red elemental creature token. Alright, so Raven Form was a card in Kaldheim. It was a 3-mana blue sorcery, that exiles a creature or artifact, and their controller creates a 1/1 flying bird, and it had Foretell. Alright, sounds pretty cool. It was pretty, actually, like, revolutionary, I should say. First off, it's very rare that blue gets exile effects for creatures. A lot of the time it's destroy, but even that wasn't necessarily weird. What was weird was the addition of artifact, and this is now the second set in a row where we're seeing blue being able to just exile target artifact. And I think that's really interesting that they're kind of pushing it in this direction, and this is a very similar spell to Raven form, but I think you could argue it could be better. I think both cards are good, but this one could be considered better because it can happen at instant speed. Yes, a 4/4 is pretty big, and so that is definitely a turnoff, but I think in something like Commander, where a 4/4 is not nearly as impactful as a lot of other formats, I think this card is going to see a decent amount of play, and it being printed at common is pretty awesome. Blue doesn't necessarily get a lot of this effect, and so recently we've seen a lot of it with Commander Legends. We saw it in Kaldheim, we're now seeing it here. This seems like something they're really pushing for blue to be able to do more of. Next we have Frost Trickster, 3-cost blue creature, bird wizard, 2/2 with flying, and when it enters the battlefield, tap target creature an opponent controls. That creature doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. Yeah, this is never going to see play in anything outside of limited, but can be kind of interesting there, where you can get rid of a blocker and an attacker for them the next turn. So for that, it's kind of interesting, but outside of limited, not much here. Next, we have Solve the Equation. Pay 3 mana, and one of it being blue, at sorcery speed, to search your library for an instant or sorcery card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. Really awesome. I know a lot of older formats, are not lacking in tutors, but lacking in fairly priced tutors in terms of actual dollars, and so it's awesome to see another one printed at uncommon. Tutors don't really see that much play in standard. We have Grim Tutor, which is a 3-cost tutor that lets you go for anything, and it really doesn't see play. However, the fact that you're searching for an instant or sorcery, then you maybe cast that instant or sorcery, that's 2 Magecraft triggers, so maybe we see something with that, but this just seems like a fun little card for something like Brawl or Historic Brawl or Commander or something like that. I don't see this making a big impact on your traditional formats. Next, we have a multiple choice, of course, referencing the type of, test. It's X and a blue for a sorcery. If X is 1, scry 1, then draw a card. If X is 2, you may choose a player. They return a creature they control to its owner's hands. If X is 3, create a 4/4 elemental creature token. And if X is 4 or more, do all of the above. So it's a 2-cost op at sorcery speed. That's not great. A 3-cost bounce that you don't get to control for 3 mana. Not very good, again, at sorcery speed. A 4 mana 4/4. All right, that one's not awful, honestly, especially in blue. They don't necessarily get access to that. And then a 5 mana opt, they bounce a creature and you create a 4/4. That's not bad. So this is definitely one of those very interesting designs. Honestly, Strixhaven is full of them. I think it's a really fun card. I don't think it's going to see play like in meta decks, but in something more casual like Brawl or Commander, this seems really, really fun. It does have some potential in limited. I know it is a rare, but it has, the Primari Guild, which today is Primari Day, or is it day? They care about casting really big spells, and multiple choice is a 5 mana value spell, which converted mana cost spell, when you cast it for 4, but if you need to get it up higher, for instance, the commander of the Commander decks, which I know we're not talking about limited anymore, if you cast a CMC or a mana value 10 spell, then you can actually do a bigger effect, and so you could actually pump more mana into this than you need to kind of hit the mana value that Primari wants, and so I find that to be very interesting, just so that, you can put as much as you want into X, and it may not do anything, but it can interact with your permanents. On top of that, it's just really interesting design. Next, we have Believed Poet. It's a 2-cost black creature, human warlock, and whenever it attacks, you may pay 2 life. If you do, it gains flying. I'm not a big fan of this card. Just play a better card. Next, we have Enormous Disappointment. Pay 4 mana, instant. Each player loses 2 life, draw 2 cards. Honestly, not that bad. I know there's a lot of spells that would be like, you lose 2 life, draw 2 cards, and for 4 mana, it is a bit expensive, and I don't know how much play it'll actually see in something like Commander, but it's definitely a nice budget alternative if you are looking for something in black. Would not say this card is an enormous disappointment, maybe just a little one. Next, we have Bat Eye. I find this very hard to believe. It's probably more accurately Eye-Bat, but whatever, that's how they're translating it. It's a black creature bat with flying, and when it dies, learn. Pretty good. You're tutoring something out of your sideboard or discarding a card to draw a card. Not my favorite. You're probably not actually going to run this, but in limited, not bad. Or maybe you might be able to, depending on the lessons, you might be able to put this in like a sacrifice-based deck, depending on what lessons there are, if there's any that the sacrifice deck necessarily wants to go get. Next, we have Mage Hunter. It's a 4-cost black creature horror 3/4, and whenever an opponent casts or copies an instant or sorcery spell, so it's Magecraft, but in the reverse, where it's your opponents, they lose 1 life. So it's an answer to Magecraft and instant and sorcery spells. I really don't see this becoming too big of a deal. However, if their combo decks take off in something like Standard, because right now, I don't know if you know this, any Magecraft ability, because it counts when it copies, it means that if you can copy a copy with a copy, I know that's a little confusing, you can infinitely copy a spell, because you're copying a copy, which then you use that copy to copy another copy, and then you're just essentially infinitely copy a spell, which means you can get infinite Magecraft triggers. So if that becomes a common way to win, this could be a pretty awesome sideboard card, and I feel like that's probably why it's in here, is in case something goes wrong like that. Next, we have Sinister Dominance, and I think this is a really awesome spell. It's a 4-cost black instant. You may pay 1 in a black instead of paying the spell's mana cost. If you pay 1 in a black, an opponent may draw a card. Exile target creature or planeswalker. Alright, first off, it's a little weirdly worded. I would have said you may pay 1 in a black instead of paying this spell's mana cost. If you pay it this way, draw a card, or your opponents draw a card. So the idea here is that if you have the 4 mana, you can exile target creature or planeswalker, but if you need to do it now, you're like, I only have 2 mana, I hate giving them a card, but honestly, anything else they draw will be better, you can instead pay 2 mana. And I think it's really versatile. It's almost like cards with Kicker. It's kind of just Kicker, where it's, you know, a 2-cost spell that says Kicker 2, exile target creature. If this spell wasn't kicked, you know, an opponent draws a card. I don't know what the actual wording is. Whenever you pay that, an opponent draws a card. I'm reading through it both in, I believe that's Spanish and English, and that's what it says in Spanish. I don't know how that would be translated. Is it target opponent? Is it each opponent? I think that'll really depend, actually make an impact on something like Commander. Then again, Commander doesn't run too much single target removal like this, but I think control decks in Standard and Historic may really like this card. Next, we have Illustrious Historian. It's a 2-cost red creature, human shaman, 2/1, and you can pay 5 and exile it from your graveyard to create a tapped 3/2 red and white spirit creature token. I don't really see this seeing play in anything outside of limited, but it's an interesting design. You're wanting to discard things in that deck, and so if you can discard this, you can maybe get some value from it later. And it is leaving your graveyard, and it's contained on that card, so you can maybe have some fun interactions through that. Next, we have Sudden Breakthrough. It's a 2-cost red instant. Target creature gets +2/+0 and gains first strike until end of turn, then create a treasure token. So this doesn't seem super amazing, but in limited, this is going to be a pretty good card, and here's the reason why. Primari's theme is big spells, but how do you cast big spells? You need ramp, and you don't have access to green. So with Primari, they're creating treasure tokens. That's kind of their big thing, is we're creating treasure to cast big spells to go all out, and you're going to notice that a lot today. Next, we have Explosive Welcome. It's an 8-cost red instant. It deals 5 damage to any target and 3 damage to any other target, and then add red, red, red. Alright, so kind of disappointing, and I know a lot of people don't like it. It's 8 mana for a whole 8 damage, but then you do get some mana back. It's definitely not my favorite, but if you're looking for high-value targets in Limited, definitely an option. Also interesting to maybe copy. You can get a bunch of mana that way. I don't know. This one just is expensive, and it is definitely splashy, I would say, but I don't know if it's 8 mana expensive. Think about the fact that ultimatums are only 7 mana. Yes, they're much easier to cast this spell. The 1 extra mana is significantly easier to cast than getting 7 specific colors of mana, but just consider when you're in that mana range, what could you be casting? Next, we have Grinning Ignis, and I think this card is actually going to be pretty good. It's a 3-cost red creature elemental 2/2. You can pay a red and return it to its owner's hand, and add colorless red. Activate this ability only anytime you cast a sorcery. Okay, so Why is this good? Well, in Limited, again, it's a way of ramping. I mean, you essentially are generating 2 mana off of this, and then you can do that like every other turn. So for that deck that wants to play really big Prismari spells and gain some benefit off of it, it's going to like it. But also in Historic, we're getting the introduction of Storm, and this is a card that you can repeatedly play for 1 mana. For instance, you play him for 3, you pay another red, return him to your hand. You get colorless red. You use that colorless red to cast him, and then you pay a red to return him to your hand. So you can infinitely play this as long as you can keep paying the 1 red mana. So because of that, Storm decks in Historic, which are going to be new, may consider running him because it means you can bring the Storm count up for 1 mana consistently. If you combine this with an Enter the Battlefield ability, for instance, dealing 1 damage to your opponent, creating a treasure token, adding mana, if you can add it to your mana, you go infinite right there. So I think this has a lot of potential. It's also going to really help in Limited with, of course, those really expensive spells, and I think because of that, it's an interesting design. Oh, one other thing. It's an elemental, which means in Historic, the Risen Reef decks are going to like it because you can pay 1 mana to make an element enter the battlefield, which means you basically pay 1 mana to either draw a card or put a land from the top of your library onto the battlefield. So pretty crazy. Next we have Hall Monitor. It's a red creature, Lizard Shaman, 1/1 for 1. Haste, but you can pay 1 and a red, and target creature can't block this turn. This actually isn't that bad. I mean, a 1/1 for 1 with haste already maybe could see some play, and then you add the fact that you might be able to make their big creature not be able to block. I think it really depends on what the meta ends up looking like. If it ends up being people are putting down tons of creatures, this probably won't see play. But if the meta turns into, let's, I don't know, mutate onto this ward creature or something, I doubt that, but if it turns into like getting down 1 big creature, then this could become really good as you're able to kind of just get around your opponent's stuff. So I actually think this has some potential. Next, we have Igneous Inspiration. It's a 3-cost red sorcery, and it deals 3 damage to any target, and then you learn. Alright, so 3 mana for 3 damage is already kind of overpriced, especially when you add the fact that it's a sorcery. But then you consider the fact that this spell is technically a cantrip, and you're not just cantripping for a random spell, you're cantripping for the perfect spell in your sideboard, and you realize this card is not that bad. Next, we have Make Your Mark. It's a red or a white for an instant, and it says target creature gets +1/+0 until end of turn. When that creature dies this turn, create a 3/2 red and white spirit creature token. Alright, so you maybe give it the 1 bonus power it needs to kill the enemy. It's probably going to trade because you didn't give it any extra bonus toughness, and when it does, you get a 3/2. Put this on a small little guy, it replaces itself. Even if you put it on a big guy, it at least is replacing itself. I think it could really see some play maybe in a equipment deck where you don't really want your creatures to die, but you know, this will at least give you another creature to equip all that stuff onto. Next we have Relic Sloth. Not really going to talk about this one. It's a 5-cost Boros 4/4 Vigilance Menace. It's fine. Pretty good at attacking. Pretty good at blocking. Not really interesting. Next, we have Elemental Summoning. It's a 5-cost red or blue sorcery lesson. Create a 4/4 blue and red elemental creature token. So at its face, this is a 4/4 for 5. However, you are getting a Magecraft trigger off of casting it, and it has Lesson, meaning that this is technically a creature that you can get with Learn. So just for that, I think it'll have value. Maybe not like monetary value, but it'll have like value to that kind of deck where maybe you don't need any of these fancy effects. You kind of just need a creature, and this can do that. Next, we have Spectacle Mage. It's a 3-cost blue and red creature bird shaman 2/2 with flying, and it says instant and sorcery spells you cast with mana value 5 or greater cost 1 less to cast. So if you have a 5 CMC/mana value spell, it now becomes a 4 CMC mana value spell, and so it becomes a lot easier to cast. Actually going to be a pretty good card for those Prismari decks, because if you can get out 2 of these, then you know your 7 drops are now 5 drops, and this is a 3 drop, meaning you probably have it pretty quickly. And you're going to notice we're going to get some expensive but really good spells. Next, we have Prismari Pledge Mage. It's a red or a blue and a red or a blue for a 3/3 with Defender. So that's pretty good, except for the fact that it has Defender. But whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery, it loses Defender. I hate this type of card. I want to be able to swing with my creature. I'd rather have a 2/2 for 2. And I know people are going to say, oh, you don't get that in blue. You do if you're paying double blue. And for this, you are. It's not even like it's 1 and blue/red. It is very color restrictive. Maybe you... No, I can't think of any place you'd want to play this. It's not my favorite. It's actually, I actively dislike this card. Next, we have Expression of Repetition. It is a blue and a red for a sorcery. Look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand, one of them at the bottom of your library, then exile the rest. Until the end of turn, you may play the exiled card. So you're kind of drawing 2 cards for 1 mana, but one of them you have to play now. You do have to play it this turn. You can't play it next turn. This is one of those cards that really represents what they were designing with the set, which is they want to show the difference between the 2 colors instead of the similarities. We're seeing the blue effect of, putting one into your hand and putting one under your library, and the red effect of the impulsive draw, and together they create this more powerful effect. So I definitely like it. In a red and blue deck, I'm probably running this over something like Anticipate, so pretty cool. It also says play, so you can play the land, which is going to be probably one of your better choices because you aren't going to be able to necessarily have enough mana, but lands you can, play. Next, we have Practical Research. It's a 5-cost blue and red instant, and it says draw 4 cards, then discard 2 unless you discard an instant or sorcery card. I believe we have cards like this for artifacts and enchantments, but I think they cost 4 mana and are mono-colored. This one lets you draw 4 cards and then discard 2 unless you discard an instant or sorcery, and the reason I think this one would be more expensive and multicolor is because in those decks, you're using an instant or sorcery in an enchantments matters deck, and so that's why the spell is in there, because it works well with enchantments. This is an instant or sorcery in an instant or sorcery matters deck, which instantly means it's going to be more likely to be played because it can also get bonuses off of that. On top of that, it being CMC 5 means that the Primari Guild will be able to do more with it. I said guild, college is what I meant. Melstrom Muse is a 1 and a blue, and then a blue or a red, and then a red, for a creature Genius Wizard 2/4 with flying, and whenever it attacks, the next instant or sorcery you cast this turn will cost X less to cast. That's not how it'll be worded. This is a translation. X being the power of Melstrom Muse as this ability resolves. So essentially, when you swing with him by default, the next instant or sorcery costs 2 less to cast. Pretty powerful. I mean, especially with the fact that you could maybe equip him or boost him up using an instant or sorcery, and then boom, now he maybe, makes things 5 cheaper, and boom, you're casting crazy spells I would say way too early, but this is probably turn 5 that you're casting him, so unless you're casting some 10 drop, I don't know. This seems pretty good though. I might throw it in a deck. Next, we have Rutha, Mercurial Artist. It is a 3-cost blue and red legendary creature Orc Shaman. Pay 2 and return it to its owner's hand. Copy target instant or sorcery spell you control. You may choose new targets for the copy. So it reminds me a lot of Luris, where it's a creature that's copying instants and sorceries, but this one's returning to your hand. So that means you are actually spending 5 mana to copy an instant or sorcery, and I don't think that's worth it. I would have said maybe it doesn't untap during your next untap step and make it tap so you can do it once every other turn. I don't know. Maybe you do something interesting with creature ETBs or number of times you cast your commander. That's actually something. We've gotten a lot of cards recently that's like how many times you cast your commander. For instance, Jessica. This would be a really awesome commander for the, hey, I want to cast my commander a bunch and use all the cards that say, something, the number of times you've cast your commander this game. So I think for that reason, could be kind of interesting. But outside of that, just run Luris. It's better. Except for the fact that this is repeatable. Luris, you have to find another way to flicker. So I guess there is that value that it is kind of self-contained. Next, we have Creative Outburst. It is a 7-cost blue and red instant. It deals 5 damage to any target. Look at the top 5 cards of your library. Put one of them into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So 5 damage, 5 cards. It's kind of like a mini Inspired Ultimatum, except it costs the same amount of mana, just less specific in colors. However, it has an ability. You can pay a blue or a red and a blue or a red and discard it to create a treasure token. And you're going to see this is going to appear on at least one more card. And I think it's really, really interesting. It's kind of turning, it can be either the thing you're aiming for or it can help you get to those expensive spells. It also then discards it into your graveyard. So a lot of the Lorehold cards that randomly cast things from your graveyard, it's now in there. There's a card that was revealed for Primari that exiles an instant or sorcery from your graveyard, and you put half the mana value counters. So you'd put 4 counters on it, and you can discard this turn 2, play that turn 3. There's a lot of interesting things you can do with this ability being on the card. It's kind of like cycling, but instead of getting the card, you're getting a treasure. Next, we have Expressive Artist. It is blue or a red 4 times. I'm not going to say blue or red, whatever. It's a creature orc wizard 4/4 with Magecraft, and it says whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, target a creature you control. Until end of turn, it has, if this creature would leave the battlefield, exile it instead of putting it out anywhere else, and whenever you exile this creature, create a red and blue 4/4 elemental creature token. Just note, creating the 4/4 elemental creature token is not part of the if it would leave the battlefield, exile it instead. It is something else. So for instance, if your opponents exile it for another reason, if you flicker it, you can do something interesting with that. So I could definitely see a deck that runs this and then runs like instant speed flickers, right? And you cast the flicker on the creature. In response, Expressive Artist is like, hey, target a creature. So then you target the creature you were gonna flicker. Then that creature says, hey, when I get exiled, I create a 4/4, and then you flicker the creature, which then it gets exiled, creates a 4/4, and essentially with this out, any instant or sorcery that flickers something also creates a 4/4. So I actually think that could be really interesting, and if this was legendary, I would be totally building a Brawl deck around it. But because of that, I think it's a little too inconsistent for my likings, but I think that definitely has some potential, especially maybe in a Yorian kind of flickery kind of deck. But note, you're probably not running red in that, meaning you're playing this for 4 blue mana, which means make sure you have good color fixing. Next, we have Flame Scroll Celebrant and Revel in Silence. Flame Scroll Celebrant is a 2-cost red creature human shaman, 2/1, and whenever an opponent activates an ability that isn't a mana ability, Flame Scroll Celebrant deals 1 damage to that player. So this includes planeswalkers, by the way. In the past, it really didn't. So that's exciting. This is going to be good against decks that like to activate a lot of abilities, kind of a sideboardy card for that reason. And then you can pay 1 and a red, and it gets +2/+0 until end of turn. But then you can also cast Revel in Silence. It's a white and a white for a legendary, not a legendary, sorry, nowhere does it say legendary on here. For an instant, your opponents can't cast spells or activate Planeswalker loyalty abilities this turn, exile it. Alright, so they can still go to combat, but they can't cast and they can't really advance their board state at all, except for activating, obviously, normal abilities. I think it's interesting. We have a card, Silence, that actually isn't on MTG Arena, but it does something similar, but doesn't turn off Planeswalkers. I think it's interesting. I don't know how much play it'll necessarily see, but again, if combo-y decks become a thing, this could totally see play. Next, we have Extis, Auric Overlord. 1 white, black for a legendary creature, human warlock, 2/4 with double strike. Whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, return target non-legendary creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Seems pretty good. I mean, especially if your cards, your instant and sorcery spells are maybe the backsides of creatures that are modal double face cards. Now you're casting an instant or sorcery, returning a creature from your graveyard. That creature happens to also have an instant on the back, and you can kind of loop them. So I think that's interesting. But I also think that it's interesting just because you're just adding a ton of value to all of your cards, and you're kind of encouraging, instant and sorcery self-mill and Azorius, which, not Azorius, Orsov, which you normally don't see. But what you also don't see is a backside to a card that's in a completely different 2-color combination in a set full of enemy color pairs. We have an ally color 8-cost Rakdos Sorcery. As an additional cost to cast the spell, you may sacrifice any number of creatures. This spell costs 2 less for each creature sacked. So if you sacrifice 3 creatures, this costs black and a red. So just remember, you can cast this for black and a red fairly easily. Each opponent sacrifices a creature. Create a 3/6 black and red avatar creature token with haste, and whenever this creature attacks, it deals 3 damage to each opponent. Yeah, I think this is a pretty good card. I mean, you don't even need to be running both sides of it. I mean, I could see myself putting this in a deck just for that. For instance, if I'm caring about sacrificing creatures, get a couple scorpions out, maybe a cat or whatever. Actually, I think cat got banned. It's the oven that didn't get banned. Just essentially take a bunch of creatures, sack them, and I say a bunch, it's only 3. Like, honestly, 3 mana, or sack 3 creatures, 2 mana for a 3/6 that's going to make everyone sacrifice something except for you, and then whenever it attacks, it's dealing 3 damage, and it has haste. This card seems really, really good to me. And it looks like a very terrifying threat that would be very difficult for the, the schools to take down. And it is a story spotlight card until our next card, Culmination of Studies, where they kind of just brought down the Blood Avatar 1 card later, spoiled on the same day. Either way, it's an X and a blue and a red for a sorcery, and it says exile the top X cards of your library. For each land card exiled this way, create a treasure token. For each blue card exiled this way, draw a card. And for each red card exiled this way, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. So pretty powerful, especially for that land part. If you can maybe guarantee lands are going to be on top or pay enough, like this is just really, really good. You're ramping, drawing cards, and dealing damage, which are the 3 ways you win the game. Or like the 3 most important things to be doing. I think obviously red cards are the weakest of this. And obviously, by the way, you don't get the exiled cards. You just exile them and they sit in exile. So keep that in mind as well. But I think it's definitely an interesting card. Again, it's an X spell. So for, what was I going to say? For Prismari, for their mana value carrying, you can, pay more and have it do more for Prismari. Next we have, speaking of Prismari, Galazeth Prismari. It's a 4-cost, blue and red, legendary creature, Elder Dragon. So this is the Elder Dragon of Prismari. When it enters the battlefield, create a treasure token. So you're kind of getting a mana back, so it's kind of a 3-cost. And then it says, artifacts you control have tap, add a mana of any color. Use this mana only to cast instant and sorcery spells. Alright, this is going to be a Brawl Commander. I'm totally going to play it. It essentially turns all of your treasure tokens into permanent tapping lands. Of course, they can only cast instants and sorceries, but essentially it kind of just turns treasures into lands for instants and sorceries, but you still have the option to sack them if you need the mana. I think this plus something like Goldspan Dragon, which makes your treasures tap for more mana and, creates treasures when things get targeted and attack. I think this is going to be really awesome. I want to build an Isn't Treasure ramp into huge spells deck, and I'm really excited for it. Next, speaking of big Elder Dragons, we have Tanazir Quandrix. It's a 5-cost Simic legendary creature Elder Dragon. Alright, I'm scared. It's a Simic Mythic. Let's go. 4-cost, or not a 4-cost, 4/4 Flying Trample. Okay. When it enters the battlefield, double the number of +1/+1 counters on target creature you control. Well, that's fine. I mean, that requires you to have set up your board with a creature with has +1/+1 counters. And then whenever it attacks, you may have the base power and toughness of other creatures you control become equal to Tanzir's power and toughness until end of turn. So clearly this is wanting to go in a deck that's running a lot of 0/0s, because if you don't know, if you put 4 counters on a 0/0, which a lot of Hydras will be. There'll be 0/0s that then enter with counters. If you set their base power and toughness to 4/4, you're actually boosting them all 4/4. Plus, if you're putting, if you're putting counters on this guy, you can make all your creatures bigger. So this is clearly going on just a +1/+1 counter deck, not necessarily a land deck. And it's one of the more uninspired designs, in my opinion, for the Elder Dragons. I really didn't like the Orsov one, but at least it was a little bit more interesting than this. Next, we have Magma Opus. It's an 8-cost blue and red instant mythic. It deals 4 damage divided as you choose among any number of targets. Okay, so that's 4 mana divided as you choose. And it sounds, any number of targets. That sounds amazing. That means that, best, I guess you're dealing 1 damage to 4 different things. Then you are going to tap 2 target permanents. They don't untap, by the way. Then you create a 4/4 blue and red elemental creature token, and then you draw 2 cards. So you're doing a lot, but nothing is super duper amazing. I mean, 4 damage divided as you choose among any number of targets. That's what, a 3 mana spell? Tap 2 target permanents. That's like a 2 mana spell. Create a 4/4 4 mana and draw 2 cards, 3 mana. So it's definitely, rather than casting all the spells separately, it does more. But what makes it really interesting is the fact that you can pay 2, discard it, and create a treasure. Not only are you ramping, which means you can put this in a deck and not worry about it getting stuck in your hand, but it also means you can build it in a deck where you want it to go into your graveyard, where you're going to free cast it later. So I think because of that, it's really interesting, and I really like this ability and hope we see it on more cards. Next, we have Primari Campus. This confirms that this is going to be a cycle that all have the same ability. Essentially, they enter the battlefield tapped, tap to add a color, whether, one of the 2 colors of the college, and then you can pay 4 and tap and do, a scry effect, scry 1. So a lot of people are calling these better than temples. I'm still not sold on them. I think they're really good and limited in formats that are slower, where you're going to be top decking sometimes. But in faster formats, oftentimes you want that scry land just to make sure you're hitting your land drops early in the game, and paying 4 mana to do that really isn't happening early in the game. So I'm still torn on them, but I think it really shows how much temples are not rare quality anymore and should probably be brought down to uncommon. Next, we have a really interesting one. Cody Vorvos. Oh my gosh. Vosphorus Codex, sorry about that, 3 cost legendary artifact creature construct 1/4, and it says you can't cast permanent spells. So instantly, this makes me want to put it in like Zaydru in Commander, which likes to give away permanents and be like, haha, now you can't cast permanent spells. But it does have an ability, pay 4 and tap to add Wooburg. When you cast your next spell this turn, exile cards from the top of your library until you exile an instant or sorcery with lesser mana value. Until end of turn, you may cast that card without paying its mana cost. Put each other card exiled this way on the bottom of your library in a random order. So not only this stops you from casting permanent spells, but it also kind of ramps you. You're paying 4 mana and tapping it to get 5 mana. So if you can spend Wooburg on it, you can do some interesting things. I mean, I don't know if this would go in a Joda deck because you're wanting to cast permanents, but maybe a all spells Joda deck might run this just because everything can be cast for Wooburg. But you also don't need to spend all that mana. It's not like if you spend all 5 of this mana, do this. It's just the next spell you cast. So essentially, if you cast like a 6-drop, then you are going to basically cascade into a 5-drop instant or sorcery, cast it for free. I think it's really interesting. I was not expecting Cody to be a creature in this. I thought he was just like a, part of the marketing, but nope, he's actually a creature, and he's actually pretty awesome. He's one of those colorless creatures that's actually a 5-color commander, meaning it can fit into a lot of different builds. Next, we have Wandering Archaic. It's a 5-cost creature avatar, and this is a really awesome card. You can, whenever an opponent casts an instant or sorcery spell, they may pay, that's a little harder to say than I thought, they may pay 2 if tongue twister, apparently messed me up for the future sentence. If they don't, you may copy that spell. You may choose new targets for the copy. So if you didn't get that through all of my stuttering and rambling and all of that, think about it like this. If your opponent casts a shock, which deals 2 damage to any target, they can pay 2 generic mana. If they don't, you get a shock and you get to choose where it goes. So, if they cast a take an extra turn spell, they better be paying 2 extra, otherwise you're also taking an extra turn. Now, don't expect to be getting these amazing spells off of it just because generally it just... a lot of the time this is just going to read your opponent's instant and sorceries cost 2 more, but that's pretty good. For instance, the removal spell they're probably going to use on this needs to cost 2 more unless they're fine with one of their creatures getting destroyed. I think it's really, really interesting and can be combined with some interesting chaos cards. For instance, one that makes people start casting things out of their hand. Then you get Explore the Vastlands. It's a 3-cost sorcery, and it says each player looks at the top 5 cards of their library, reveals a land and or instant or sorcery card from among them, and puts the revealed card in their hand, and the rest on the bottom of their library in a random order. Each player gains 3 life. So it is making each player do this, so I don't love it at all, but if you are, being mana screwed or whatever, it is a nice little option to have on the back. Alright guys, that is it for this video. I know it was a long one. It's about 3 minutes shorter than yesterday's video, but they've been spoiling a lot, and I've had a lot to say because this set has been so interesting. As I said in my Discord, which you should check out in the comments down below, Strixhaven is the set that's made me go, oh, there's so much I can do with this card. Where Kaldheim was kind of just like, oh, this card was designed for this purpose. It works well for that. So there's a lot more to talk about with this set. And if you want to talk about it with me, again, check out my Discord. Hit the like button if you enjoyed the video and hit that subscribe button to stay up to date with everything. I will see you in the next one. Bye.